Well, I'd like to bring this hearing to order of the Rules and Reference Committee hearing on considering recommendations from the Charter Review Committee. I'm Zach Klein, the President of Columbus City Council. I'd like to welcome my colleagues Shannon Hardin, Michael Stenziano, and President Pro Tem Priscilla Tyson for joining me today. And of course, our honored and featured guest, Stephanie Coe, the chair of the committee. Thank you, Stephanie, I want to say this publicly, for the work that you and the other members of the committee, Lourdes Barroso de Padilla, Jeanette Bradley, Frida Gilliard, Pastor Tyrone Laws, Fred Mills, and Carrie McCarthy, as well as other folks who have come and joined the committee. I know John Rosenberger and Bob Vitale also did some work on the committee as well, and we're grateful for the time away from your friends and family that you did for free on behalf of the people of the city of Columbus. This, for folks to recall, there was a citizen-led initiative on the way council was drawn on a special election. And in response to that, council, both Mayor Ginther and our representative Shannon Hardin, convened this committee, a bipartisan committee consisting of independents, Democrats, and Republicans, to come together to decide whether in 2017 the current council structure was adequate to serving the citizens of Columbus in the manner that should be desired and expected from their city and local government. A result is this presentation that, again, Chair Coe will be given to us about what those charter review recommendations were. This council will then have the duty of delving into the details beyond this hearing, which will be led by Shannon Hardin, the council representative, moving forward on this particular issue for a determination of what the details beyond the recommendations. I know there were some general recommendations, some specific recommendations, at least the ones that need to be specified out in charter per instructions from the Columbus City Attorney, what those details are moving forward for the possibility of it being on the ballot in November of 2017, which this council would have an obligation to take a vote on no later than our last meeting in July in order to qualify per Ohio state law for the 2017 November general election ballot. So at this time, Councilmember Hardin, do you want to say any comments?
Well, thank you, President Klein, for your leadership, and certainly thank you to our colleagues, President Pro Tem Tyson and Councilmember Stenziano, and really all of our colleagues on council for going down this road with us. And certainly thank you to Chair Coe. You know, citizen represented leadership on an initiative like this or a conversation like this is never easy. It's voluntary, and the fact that you held, I think, 7 or 8 community meetings, and I hope that you'll be able to talk about those this evening, and heard good and bad, open conversations from each side of the city about how we, or should we, or how we move forward together. Certainly want to thank all the members of the committee, and while this committee was formed nearly a year ago, the recommendations that we will hear tonight could have lasting impacts on our city for decades. So we don't take these conversations lightly, and we don't move on them quickly. We have conversations as a community, and we come up with our directions through open dialogue. And so I think that this is the next step in that dialogue, and I am certainly looking forward to hearing from you and from our staff. Thank you, Edward Johnson from Legislative Affairs, Council Legislative Affairs, for being a point on the council side. Many hours of work have gone so far. So with that, I would turn it over to any other council members to say any words, and then to Stephanie.
President Pro Tem Tyson or Councilmember Stenziano? All right, Stephanie, Chair Coe, the floor is yours. And again, let me echo one thing that you said also, Councilmember Hardin. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for the work that you did in assisting council and the mayor's office in the preparations for this presentation and all the work done on the Charter Review Committee. Chair Coe, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Council President Klein, Councilmember Hardin, and all members of council. First, I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to do this and your support, as well as Mayor Ginther's and the staff. I would just echo what you just said, that without the staff's research and answering our questions meeting after meeting, we wouldn't have gotten to the point that we did with all the information that we had. So I really appreciate the opportunity, as well as the support from all of you and from staff. To give you a little background, we did have a 9-member committee. We focused on public meetings throughout the city. So ultimately we had 12 public meetings, which was really about double what we originally planned as we kind of talked through this at the beginning. We wanted those meetings to occur throughout the city geographically, as well as time. Some of those meetings occurred in the evening, some occurred during the day. And I think it was also important that we accepted and encouraged comments via the internet, through the website and email, so that people who might not have been able to come to a meeting were able to submit their information, questions, those kinds of things. And then I believe all of those comments and questions or submissions were then available on the website as well. We received a total of 68 public comments, I believe, from about 35 people. One of the themes that I'll talk about as we go through the specific recommendations was a lot of discussion about geography. And I think we kind of had some buzzwords or keywords that came up over and over, and geography and transparency were two of those words that many of us felt like we heard from citizens regardless of what the topic was that they were addressing. So as I go through the recommendations, I think if you recall, geography and transparency were the two things that we heard a lot about and felt were really important. So size and structure of council, we recommended that council expand from 7 to 9 members. And I think this was really consistent with the data that we looked at, that in comparison to similarly situated cities with population or with successful cities, many had a smaller ratio of council members to citizens, and we felt like that may be one thing to help address some of the citizen input, that they want to be able to interact more with the council member or council members, that obviously having more would be more helpful. But we also wanted to be cognizant of the increase. That, you could add 2, 4, 6, you could double the size, and what would be effective. And so we felt like a recommendation to add 2 would be a good starting point, and let the structure, if that potentially became the structure, let that play out and see how that worked for the community before we would suggest adding more members beyond that. We also recommended that council move from an at-large system to a district at-large system. I think this is probably the recommendation that has the most questions and I've heard the most comment from. The idea was to apportion the city into basically 9 districts. Ultimately, you would use some type of best practice. Staff shared a lot of those potential best practices with us. We think that's something that council could explore as this moves forward, so we didn't specifically recommend how that would be addressed. The idea was that candidates would live in and file for a specific council seat. This really comes back to this conversation about geography, making sure that neighborhoods and communities feel like there's a representative that sort of lives amongst them, lives in their neighborhood and those kinds of things. But it was very important to many of us that every Columbus voter still maintains the ability and the right to elect all members of council. So that was really kind of where we came to this, I don't know if you want to call it a hybrid, but this idea of a district system, but that it wasn't true wards. And I think really for most of our meetings and dialogue, I would say maybe 2/3 of it, we seemed to be leaning towards a recommendation of no change to the structure of council. But I think as the meetings kind of came to a conclusion, we came back a lot to the geography question and how we could address that. So that was ultimately how we came to that recommendation. We recognize, though, that this recommendation kind of breaks with what previous charter review bodies have done, as well as the voters have clearly spoken as recently as August of 2016 that they did not want a district system. And so we felt like, looking at the different systems that are in place throughout the country, that this would give Columbus an opportunity to be a leader. There aren't really any structures exactly like this. There are some that are similar, but I think Columbus has always been a leader in a lot of areas, and this would be another opportunity for that to happen. We did not specifically get into the details of what that would look like. We felt like because that was such a big recommendation or change, that it would be important for council to explore that with the community in a lot more community settings, forums, getting more input before something like that would actually be put on the ballot. So we did not try to flesh out those aspects. We think that's what you all could learn from more community meetings and things like that. With respect to vacancies and appointments, we think that there needs to be a clearly spelled out appointment process that would be in the administrative code so that it's consistent for each occurrence. We added the recommendation of a public hearing basically to address the issue of transparency. That I think a lot of the input we got was that people wanted more transparency. And our thought process was that if there was at least one public hearing, then members of the community could participate in, listen to, see the answers and information provided by a final candidate or final candidates that council had narrowed it down to. So we didn't necessarily expect every applicant to be considered by any means. We were really looking at, once council has narrowed that down to one or two people, that there would be an opportunity for the community to either ask questions or hear answers to questions, those kinds of things. We also wanted the vote not to occur on the same day as the public hearing. Again, an issue of transparency to just kind of address that citizens would be able to then follow up, submit comments, questions after they've heard all of the information that was included. We did not specifically recommend that, well, no, that was our recommendation for the process itself. There was also discussion about, trying to think of the right word. Yes, the caretaker, thank you. Whether or not a recommendation to actually amend the charter to address a caretaker position. So basically the idea that the person that was appointed to fill an unfulfilled term would not be able to run. And we ultimately like that idea conceptually, but we didn't want to recommend that as an actual charter amendment. We feel like council should address that prior to each vacancy. And in part, that was because we were recommending the structural change to council, which may create a lot more challenges in finding the right person to fill those seats, especially if you're going to have to fill a role of a caretaker and then have someone on the ballot as well. But we also thought each situation could be unique, and instead of trying to come up with a complicated rule that might not make sense in every situation. You know, we kind of walked through all the hypotheticals. What if there were 6 vacancies and, you know, all those different kinds of things. So we felt like it would be better for council to not have it required in the charter, but be able to articulate why it was in the best interest of the city at the time in which the vacancy occurred. And then we didn't recommend any specific changes on the discussion of employment status, like is this a full-time or part-time position. I think there was a lot of different information back and forth, but we believe that ultimately each member of council has to determine how they're best serving the citizens of Columbus, so we did not make a specific recommendation there. The final sort of category of topics that we addressed were area commissions, and none of our recommendations there are to change the charter, but as we started and really finished this process back to the geography idea and transparency, finding a way for every citizen or any citizen who wants to be more involved in what's happening and impacting their neighborhood. For me, as someone who sits on an area commission, that is really one of the best ways. So how we figure out how to get more people aware of area commissions, more people attending meetings, bringing issues to area commissions, and making that process more consistent across the city, we felt like would address a lot of these issues relative to geography and transparency. As you're all aware, things like zoning have come before an area commission months, if not years, before they ever make it to your agenda. And so if the community was better informed about those opportunities, that's really where we can hash out some of the challenges and address those issues. So I think this was one of the recommendations we also felt like didn't need as much time, that many of these things may take time to evaluate and ultimately put on a ballot if you were to do that, but the area commission piece could really be done relatively immediately. So there was a commission on commissions in the past some of you were part of. We would like to see that sort of resurrected and redefined and used so that the area commissions can work together maybe better than when we do today. There's some consistency of, you know, getting staff support for bylaws and how zonings, for example, are handled. So as I'm sure you're all aware, area commissions handle zoning applications very differently. And so ultimately, it's difficult for a developer or even a citizen to know what the process is. So as one example, my area commission provides notice just to the same people who will get notice throughout the city's process. We provide that before we address it as an area commission so that we don't hear later that people weren't aware of it, and the first notice comes when it's at the development commission or here at council. And so we thought some of those things would help address knowledge and help citizens feel like they're engaged. As part of that, as you know, I believe there's 19 area commissions today, but they don't necessarily cover every bit of the city. So one of our recommendations was to ensure that area commissions are covering all parts of the city and maybe reevaluate what that looks like, and really just engage the community again with how we could best utilize area commissions. So that is in general the recommendations that we made. I know there's a lot of detail that was contained in the report, and staff provided us extensive research on topics week after week. So a lot of that information I know Edward could share if there's specific questions. But thank you for your time and the opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Coe. Just so I understand, the recommendations for charter changes were the 7 to 9 council members, the by place district yet at-large representation. Was the what in the appointment process, if anything, was a charter recommendation change?
Edward, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the only thing in the charter that would be a charter change for the appointment process was the number of days. That I believe currently the number of days would be limited. I think it's 30, if I recall correctly. And so in order to have a public hearing and then have a vote after that, we felt like there would be a need for more time to actually appoint someone. So the recommendation was to add an additional 15 days, making it 45 days, so that there would be enough time in the process to have that public hearing and input.
And then there was nothing in the area commission
Correct.
That was a charter change?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
When you view this proposal, did the committee or yourself take into consideration whether this was one package to be presented to the voters, or whether 7 to 9 members should be considered, by place should be considered, or should it be one consideration?
We discussed that a little bit. I would say ultimately we really would leave that to council. We did not come up with a specific recommendation. I think part of what we talked about was the time in which something goes on the ballot and then when it would become effective. So I think it obviously could be done in parts. There were members of the committee who felt strongly that if it went from 7 members to any other number, there should be structural changes as well. But ultimately we decided that was not a recommendation that we would specifically include.
Speaking of timing, was there any conversation about the timing as it relates not to the ballot placement, but for the actual implementation of the plan? And was everything considered as a whole, or were things considered separately? For an example, was there any consideration or discussions about how this would take effect in 2019 or 2021? Was there any consideration of whether moving from council from 7 to 9 should take place in 2019 and by place in 2021, say following after the census data comes out? Just curious what the commission's thoughts were on that.
We definitely discussed, I would say, all of that. I think that would be one of the things I would think you would want to look at best practices as council looks at these issues moving forward, that figuring out exactly which seats would be up for which election, those kinds of things was obviously not details we got into. Really, I think that would be sort of the next process if the recommendation was to move forward with something like this. But I think we definitely had discussions that it could be done at one time in 2019. We also had a lot of discussions about practically that taking till 2021 and what that would look like. I think census data and all of that would be an important part of what that may ultimately look like.
Thank you, Chair Coe. Any questions from my colleagues? Councilmember Stenziano.
Thank you, President Klein. One thing in terms of the boundaries, could you explain who would be drawing them, how that organization would occur?
Sure. I think that's another topic that we believe you all should address kind of as best practices. We looked at some of the different options that are used throughout the country, whether it's appointing a committee that then makes recommendations to council, whether their recommendation is the one that's used or they present to council 3 options. There are a lot of different processes that are in place throughout the country. So I think, again, as you explore this idea, if it's something the city is actually going to go down, I think addressing how those boundaries would be determined would be an important part of that, but we did not specifically really have the time to go into trying to figure that out ourselves, and we felt like council should address the, I guess, conceptual idea with the community before we even got to the point of exactly how those would be drawn.
First of all, Stephanie, thank you for your work, and Edward, thank you also, and also to the committee. Just a question, I know the word is you're using is neighborhoods, that someone's represented by their neighborhood, and I just, the question I have is because I know it's, if 850,000 people, and if you even divide it by 9, or, you know, if that were to be the new body, that's not, I think we have to be careful of the wording, because I don't think these neighborhoods make up districts, but to say someone's going to be, you know, you'll be represented by someone in your neighborhood, I think we have to be very, you know, careful in our wording, because a neighborhood of almost 100,000 people is not just generally one neighborhood. So just a caution when we're talking about that. The question, and then you did say that 2/3 of the committee, I'm sure I heard that right, 2/3 of the committee believe that, said no change in regards to the being in a district. Did I hear you correctly? But that then they decided that after thinking it over, you know, having a lot of conversation, we moved to having the, you know, at place. Was that correct?
No, that's not exactly what I was saying. What I was saying was we didn't specifically take a vote or come up with a recommendation as we were listening to all of the information throughout the process. But I think as we had discussions and asked questions, I think it was clear that many people were leaning towards leaving the structure recommendation in place. And at one of our meetings where we first started coming up with recommendations for our, with the language for our recommendations, that was really the path we went down. I wouldn't say 2/3 of anyone disagreed with this recommendation. I think it was either unanimous or one person disagreed, if I recall correctly. Ultimately, it was really just the timing is the 2/3 I was referencing. So a lot of the time that we met, we seemed to be leaning more towards recommending the structure remain the way it is. But I think many of us still had the lingering issue of how do we address geography. And just to comment on your first point, I think that's one of the things that I and others find extremely important, that whether you make it 9 members or 11 members or whatever, you're still talking about a huge amount of people that aren't all similar in however those boundaries are ultimately drawn, which is really why we came back to the area commissions over and over, that there are more of them. There will be more of a local voice, and many area commissions are made up of representatives from smaller neighborhoods, and so that really being one of the best ways we saw to actually potentially get more neighborhood input and not just a district or a geographic area.
Okay, and I would agree. I think that the area commissions and civic associations certainly do play a significant role, and could play an even stronger role even now, whether we have adopted this or not. So the other question, and this will be the last I think I'll ask about this, is that you said you wanted to extend the appointment process for the 30 to 45 days so that we could have this public process. And so I just kind of want to understand that process. And you said once you get down to 1 or 2 people, then maybe the candidates there'd be a public meeting. And so who would be asking those questions?
I think the specifics of how that would go would be left up to council.
Oh, okay.
We had some discussions back and forth about whether it was fair to an applicant to leave it wide open to all citizen questions, whether it would be submitted questions that all candidates would answer. I think any structure like that, or if it was council just asking them questions, we felt like just having some ability for members of the community to see and hear from the candidate or candidates that you were considering.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councilmember Hurd.
Thank you, President Klein, and again, thank you, Stephanie, our Chair Co. I see another committee member here, Ms. Lourdes de Patilla, Barossa Badilla. I apologize. I kind of following President Pro Tem's line of questioning around this by-place conversation. And maybe is around actually the conversation. How so there is we had an election in last year, 2015, about this. It was soundly defeated. How did committee members come back to this geography question? How was it still lingering out there? And how does the committee in their recommendations feel like we're getting a step closer or a step better? Like how are we coming to a middle, and how do we define that, what the middle is, if that's a fair question?
Yeah. I think that looking at different structures of councils throughout the country, there were a wide variety that potentially had districts or had no districts, sort of a little bit of everything throughout. And it was a lot of conversation around the fact that there have been charter review commissions, I believe, and charter review committees in the past that have not recommended a change to the structure. And clearly the voters have had this issue presented to them a number of times, as recently as August of 16. But it still felt like, as we listened to citizens, and some of them made comments that were not necessarily on topic, and others that were, but there still seemed to be this desire to have more of the feeling of more representation in their community. And I think that was one of the things you heard a lot during the previous campaigns, was this idea of someone from their neighborhood. And we recognize that their neighborhood is not a realistic explanation, but the idea of having someone who lives in an area that's maybe similar or more similar would be effective. And I think we were also thinking about this from the standpoint of being proactive instead of reactive. Maybe the city's not there yet, and this kind of goes to President Klein's questions about timing. Maybe the city is not ready for a structure change today, but what does that look like? And again, back to the city really having been a leader in a lot of things across municipalities and the country, is this a point in time in which Columbus can take a leadership role and think about representing the citizens proactively? So again, I think our recommendation was that council explore these issues, whether that means it's on the ballot in 2017 or it's looked at for the future. I think the idea was that council would spend time with the community and try to figure out what the boundaries could look like. What would this mean? And it may ultimately still be something that council doesn't feel is appropriate, or ultimately the voters don't feel is appropriate when put before them. But I think it would be a proactive step to addressing an issue that seems to continue to come up. I mean, I think we've heard this geography or neighborhood representation, and we were trying to be as creative, but also using the data that we were shown to figure out what could be a solution to those concerns.
Thank you. Edward, Edward, as it pertains to how we, or maybe actually Chair Code too, how we got from the 7 to 9 recommendation, and then how we have planned or decided how we would move from increasing from there. Was that a best practice that we observed around the country, or how do we choose when and how we would add additional council members?
Sure, I'll let Edward address the specific data, but what we looked at was really a lot about the council member to citizen ratio. And Columbus has one of the smaller number of council members that in many jurisdictions, as well as one of the larger ratios of citizens to council member. So we felt like there needed to be an increase, as I said before. I think it's a 20-some% increase over the size of council, and if we went to 11 members, you're talking about almost a 60% increase. That seemed like a little too much, too fast, and so trying to figure out the best course. And I think Edward could address the specifics.
Certainly, President Klein, Councilmember Harden. What staff wanted to do is we wanted to look at a subset of cities that we felt would be comparable and appropriate for us to look at. So we used the Best Cities Index, which ranks the 62 largest cities on a variety of metrics. What we found is that when we started to group Columbus with our peer cities in terms of growth and placement on the Best Cities Index, it was difficult to do an apples-to-apples comparison. Some cities are mayor-council cities, which is very different from a council-manager city. But in terms of growth rates, style of governance, and closeness in population, we've basically found that our closest peers, when you average their council size, the average number of council members was 9.6 members. And so I believe the committee received that and said, well, we can pick 9 or we can pick 10, and an even-numbered legislative body is rather odd, so they chose 9, although I won't pretend to be inside the heads of the committee members, but I believe that's how they arrived at that.
I think that's accurate.
Thank you, President Klein. Councilmember Harden. A question I have that goes kind of relates to this too is the cities that you were looking at, did they also have area commissions and civic associations?
President Klein, President Pro Tem Tyson, yes, not explicitly named area commissions, and we did a presentation where certain cities had varying structures. Some of them were similar to Columbus, where geographically not every area is covered. Others had layers to neighborhood representation, where block watches then fed into a larger body, then fed into a larger body, and then fed into like a neighborhood council that advised the city council. So many of the cities had some form of an area commission, yes.
Thank you, and I ask that because certainly we want all of our residents to feel as though they have representation, and I think that the Civic Association Area Commission was set up in the city of Columbus so that they also, there was representation at council for those area commissions, and certainly even having them be, sit here, and I know this room's gotten not as much space, but certainly to be in this chambers and certainly to be able to come and share information with the council. So I'm excited that this recommendation is here, and hopefully that can strengthen the work of the area commissions, and because I think they play a very important role. The other question I'll ask, and I think you just you briefly went through this, was about just the filling of the vacancies. And so you said that the only recommendation really was about, I think, the appointment process that would be in the charter. Is that correct?
The only recommendation that would require a charter change
Would
was
be
the
that
additional
one.
days.
And then the other would be, it'd still be based upon this council as to how we would fill a vacancy. Is that correct?
Yes, we also just recommended that the process be defined. I believe it's in the administrative code that you would define that. But how you define it, we didn't make any specific recommendations other than the request to have a public hearing and to not take the vote on the filling the vacancy on the same night as the public hearing.
Because I guess my question is this, that certainly, I'm just making sure I have clarification around this, is because obviously the vacancy that we had in last year, where it was a short time period, and we wanted to have a council member seated, and thought it was best to be able to have certainly someone who was a council member previously that understood the body to be able to come in and to take on this role. So I guess at least they have that experience. So my question is did the discussion come up that based upon a council member having a vacancy at council, and maybe the vacancy was a person still at 2 years, the council member had 2 years left on their term and they had to leave for whatever reason. So in that being the case, would we, based on this proposal, would we look at trying to fill that vacancy with a person who said they would not want to run when that's over, or would it be that this body would determine it case by case?
I believe our general thought process was that the person that you appoint would be a caretaker. That was sort of the preference of many of the members of the committee, but we did not ultimately make that recommendation. Our recommendation is that council would decide, based upon all the circumstances that you've kind of just mentioned, what you would do in each particular case. So you would look at the facts of this particular vacancy and determine ahead of time, this is the process we're going to use, and move forward on each vacancy as it became a vacancy, I guess you'd say.
Right, thank you, and I appreciate that discussion, because I think that you still have to pick someone.
Yes.
If it was, you still have to pick someone to fill the seat who
Yes.
said they weren't going to run, and then you'd have someone run. So just wanted to
Yeah.
get clarification. Thank you.
Well, and President Pro Tem Tyson, as you know, that you raise an interesting point, because there's the theoretical aspect of this process, and then there's the real world aspect. Certainly having a member of council with a planned departure allows more time for a process like this to be implemented, but a sudden departure causes a little bit more issues, especially as it relates to 6 votes passing emergency legislation, just making sure that the everyday workings of the city can transpire. So knowing that a council member is going to leave in 2 months, and being able to plan for it and have an identified process is one thing. Waking up and receiving a phone call from a colleague saying, hey, by the way, I'm going to move out of town, whatever it may be, that could create a whole other set of issues, just as the city is planning for things that may pop up in the legislative agenda with abstentions from other council members, whether council members are going to be at the meeting, and thus the threshold vote that's required for, say, emergency legislation, which would be 6 votes.
And for an example, we looked at that specifically with the idea that one of the suggestions was that you would not fill the seat. And maybe if you had 1 seat not filled, that would be okay. But what would you do if 5 out of 7 members resigned for some reason, or there was some horrific incident and you had 2 members of council? So that was one of the examples of why we ultimately didn't make a recommendation to change the charter to say that you had to do any specific thing, because it seemed like it made more sense that you would address the facts of the specific situation when it developed.
President Klein, and I agree with that. I was making sure there's clarification. I think it's case by case. Like that situation that we just had was one that we had to fill it pretty quickly, and with the best person that we felt had experience. But there may be times, we always need to have, hopefully 7 people here, because again, someone may have to abstain on legislation, someone may get sick. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons that we need a full body. So just wanted to make sure that it was still open, and there was case by case, we would make that determination, which I think is fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is, I guess, more of a statement and certainly a concern or that I had as we went through this process. We wanted to make sure that, and we continue to hope that there is ample public engagement upon this process. For whatever reason, there folks were out and got this on the ballot in the past. And so when we said that we come together as a community to solve issues together, we wanted to make sure that folks actually came out, will come out, and be part of this conversation. To that end, one, I guess I would ask CTV that over the next several weeks, if we could replay those YouTube, the hearings, the public hearings, just so this can be fresh in folks' minds. I was able to watch along for many of the hearings, and yeah, they were an hour and a half, but like we said, this is really important, a really important conversation that could have lasting impacts on our community. And so I would encourage folks to stay engaged. And Edward, is there still a way for folks to email in to give feedback on what, as we go back out and have this conversation and hear from folks?
We can reactivate, I believe the email address, charter@columbus.gov, is still active for public input, and if possible, we can consult with the Department of Technology to reactivate the web form so that public input can continue to be incoming.
Okay, I think that'll be very important, at least for me, as I make my decision about how we move forward, about putting this on the ballot, is really making sure that I've heard from folks that we've taken it out once this has been presented, and that folks have had a chance to, I mean, this is a hefty report, and we want folks to dig in and give their true feedback on it before I think this council votes. And so I really do appreciate everybody who has engaged. I appreciate your leadership and the work that has been done. And I appreciate this council for allowing me just to be a part of the conversation and lead this important conversation right now.
Thank you. We do have 2 speakers. If anyone else would like to speak, we can accept some speaker slips Cheryl will direct you to where the speaker slips are available. You just need to sign one and maybe hand them to Cheryl if you're interested in speaking. You will have 3 minutes to speak on this issue. We will take them in the order received, and the first one is William Shuck. Mr. Shuck, thank you for coming down to council. If you just could state your name, your address, any organizations you represent, and you'll have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President and members of council. My name is Bill Shuck. I'm a 30-plus year resident of Northwest Columbus. I'm here representing my own views, do not represent any organization, but I believe my views represent the views of many residents of Columbus. If you look at the list of cities that are comparable to Columbus, actually the vast majority of them, nearly all of them, have at least some representatives elected from districts. And the average of the number of council members is between 11 and 13. If you kind of work with those numbers, I suppose you can get them down, but if you look at the fair totality, that's what falls out. Debate about city council districts has really centered on two extremes. The status quo, which is essentially a closed system, and a very fragmented, kind of chaotic thing that was on the ballot last year that really was not workable and presented a large number of districts. I'm here to present the idea of a middle ground, which Councilman Hardin spoke to, is what I would suggest to you is if you expand council to 11 or 13 members, you can have a majority that are still elected citywide to provide the global perspective that we all agree is important, but you could also have 5 or 6 that are elected from districts. In my previous life, I served in a state representative district with about somewhere between 110 and 120,000 people, so I have some feeling about the complexities and difficulties in representing that many people. If you divide the city into 6 districts or 5 districts, you get a manageable or semi-manageable number of people for someone to represent. I think everyone would agree that the touchstone of democracy is accountability. And having people live in a district and run citywide is really a fig leaf for the status quo. And so if you really want to get that accountability where people, you get the local flavor and you get the mix of the global, then I would suggest there's a way to do it. It's the middle ground between the current system, which is one of the smallest in the country and is not generally viewed as an open system. And the other extreme is many small districts. That's not workable either. So I would commend to you a middle ground that I think is workable. I think most voters in Columbus would probably be responsive to. And I have a prepared statement on that. There isn't enough time to go into details. I'd like to put it in the record. And appreciate your listening, appreciate your consideration.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Space, will you grab Mr. Shuck's prepared statement, please? Any questions or comments for Mr. Shuck? Councilmember Hardin?
How many copies you need?
We can make copies.
Just one?
Or if you have additional,
I have
it's fine
copies.
too. Okay, yeah, it's fine.
Yep.
Thank you, President Klein. My question is not so much for Mr. Shuck, but kind of for the committee to answer the question and a point of clarity. I wasn't advocating for one system over the other. I was just speaking of this hybrid that the committee was recommending to council. But to Mr. Shuck's point, did we explore traditional hybrids that a system like Mr. Shuck explained?
Yes, and actually Mr. Shuck submitted. Yes, we did, and actually Mr. Shuck submitted a proposal. I don't know if it's exactly the one he's presented tonight, but conceptually what he just articulated was presented to us and I think was discussed, but as I've kind of already articulated, both from the size perspective and our reasoning, we came to the recommendation that we did.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shuck. Our next speaker, and again, this is our final speaker, so if you wish to speak, please see Cheryl here to grab a speaker slip, but it's Will Petrick. If you just could state your name, any organizations you represent, your address, you'll have 3 minutes.
My name is Will Petrick, and I'm speaking on behalf of Yes We Can this evening. My address is 350 East Tompkins, Columbus, Ohio, 43202. Thank you, President Klein, members of the committee. Also, thanks to Stephanie Coe for your recommendations and your work on the Charter Committee. Yes We Can really appreciates all the work that was done. We believe that the recommendations are a step in the right direction. We feel like 9 council districts will provide better representation for residents and neighborhoods. We also support placing the proposed changes on the ballot for voters to decide. One fear that we have is just that the influence of big money and lobbyists at City Hall will continue to drown out the voices of people in the community in an all-at-large system. We'd like to see limits on campaign contributions to really check the influence of big moneyed interests. Also prefer a modernized city council structure that has, people being elected from districts by the people in those districts. So, first, we absolutely support council districts. Columbus is the only city of the largest 25 cities not to have council districts, so it's a very, I think, long overdue move to have that local district representation here at City Hall. Also support the recommendation of expansion of the size of City Council from the present 7 to 9 members, provided that that is connected with each member representing a district. One thing that kind of highlights the need for representation at the local level, there was recently a council member that asked about, where is Don Scott Airport? And so I know I don't know all of the diversity of Columbus. We have 860,000 residents. We have over 200 neighborhoods. So there is just so much going on in the city, and I think it's a big challenge for any one council person to really try to represent 860,000 people. So we really think some of these problems can be alleviated by having council districts representing people in a specific area. It would mean those districts would be familiar with the area, understand the issues, and people would have a specific person to call if they had a challenge in their neighborhood. One thing that we do disagree with is the proposal to have district council members elected at large. We believe that this will make them less accountable to the districts that they represent. It could lead to a situation where voters from that district vote for a specific person and the city chooses a different person, and so that whole idea of people not feeling heard, that could happen in that kind of a situation. The other thing, I think the intent is good to focus on citywide and a district, but feel like this still doesn't get at what is ultimately needed. But again, we still prefer the recommendations over the current structure of City Council, so do think it's a step in the right direction. Have more to say if time permits, or
Briefly, you can briefly finish.
okay. So, I think one thing that wasn't in the scope of the Charter Review Committee was campaign finance reform and campaign contribution limits. And I guess I would really encourage City Hall to, I don't know if it's come up with a review committee on that, but I think that you can't separate kind of the structure with the influence of money in terms of politics at the national level, state level, and even at the local level. So I know that's one thing that there are a lot of folks that are concerned with, just the big moneyed interests drowning out the voices of people. And I guess finally, just really do believe that district elections would make members more representative of district interests and accountable to the residents, and hope that we do see some more conversation about campaign finance reform, campaign contribution limits to reduce the influence of big money at City Hall.
Any questions or comments for Mr. Petrick? No? Okay.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah, me too.
Okay. For Chair Coe. Thank you, Mr. Petrick.
Okay.
Chair Cole, I have just a question about, so let's play through a scenario. So you have a primary, so in a district, just going with this, and so there's, I don't know, 3 or 4 people, I guess, who ran in a primary from a district. And so whoever So whoever, so 3 are running in a district, so would they not, so would the vote still be for at large? Or is the vote for the district?
I think ultimately we didn't get into the specifics. I
Okay.
think our idea was that the voters would cast a vote. Let me clarify that. All citizens would vote.
Okay.
So that you would identify that you wanted to run for District A because you live in District A, and there may be 1 or 10 people or whatever on the ballot, and then all citizens would be able to cast a ballot for those people in A, B, C, and D, regardless of where they, as a voter, live. Was our discussion, but again, that would all be part of what ultimately
Okay.
council would recommend.
Because that way, then it would really become, however, so if there were, just hypothetical, if there were 9 council members and there are 9 districts, so it would be still the top, maybe in a primary, the top 18 people would win, would be the top 18. If you had, right, because you could only have, if you have 9 districts, you would have the top 18, and then after that, the top 18 would run for a general election, and the top 9 would win. And so, again, it would be at large, so it wouldn't necessarily mean that you would have representation, if you're saying it that way, from your district and the way from the scenario that I gave you. So unless there's something
That was not
different.
how we were envisioning it. I think what we were
Okay.
envisioning was that you would, a petition to run for a particular district. If only one person was running for that district, then they would obviously not have a primary. They would be on the final ballot and probably be the person elected. So when you go to the ballot in the primary, you may have, I would assume this would be in staggered years, so you would either have 4 or 5 people, districts on the ballot, and then you would be electing or voting for, up to 2, I would assume, and then you would have a head-to-head competition in each district come November. So on the November ballot, you could have, I guess it'd be 10 or 8 people, but they would be running in a specific district. So you may have a district that had no one, only had 1 running or whatever. Yeah.
You can have a seat, Mr. Peter.
Can I just add one thing?
Of course.
So I know when Stephanie mentioned kind of looking at other cities, there was a comparison of kind of how many citizens represented per city council member. And I think when you look at that a different way around, like how many citizens are represented per council member, in an all-at-large system, you still have 860,000 people being represented by everyone. And when you look at cities close to our size, Indianapolis has 25 districts. They have roughly 34,000 people that are represented per council member. Dallas is the, I think, 9th biggest city, and they have 14 council districts. They have 93,000 citizens represented per council member. So I think continuing an all-out-large election continues to have Columbus be like, all of our council members still represent 860,000 people, which is just very, very different from a lot of the other cities comparable to our size. Thank you for your time.
I think to your point, President Pro Tem Tyson, the biggest departure on that line of the conversation is moving from what we normally do as an at-large field race to actually having seat 1, seat 2, seat 3, all the way up to seat 9, and that you would be running with several individuals within that district, even though it's being voted on at large. It would be that district's representation. So when you go to the ballot, we're now, say for this particular year in 2017, you get to vote for 3 and the top 3 vote getters win. You would simply go and, okay, I need to cast a vote for seat 1, cast a vote for seat 2, cast a vote for seat 3. Yeah, so it would be breaking up the way and style of the way the election itself is held. Our final speaker is Chip Moore. Mr. Moore, welcome back to council. If you could state any organizations you represent, you have 3 minutes.
Name's Chip Moore. I'm president of ASME Local 1632, represent all non-management, non-uniform city employees. Before my time starts, can I ask a question about, I heard some numbers earlier about 12 public hearings, 68 comments, and 35 people, is that correct?
Public meetings, 68 public comments, 35 separate individuals.
Okay. So, as a city employee, as a citizen of Columbus, my entire life, this is mind-boggling to me that we're having this conversation. The ward system was on the ballot, and it got defeated soundly. We had 12 public hearings, and 35 people showed up, and we got 68 comments on this. This was a waste of money, and I want people to understand that we are furious that this went on, because I see every day where the citizens of Columbus could have been better served with this money on their services that we provide every day. I am in the fight every day to get funding for services for the citizens of Columbus. And for this to continue to go on is mind-boggling to me. I've heard these people talking about listening to the citizens of Columbus. The citizens of Columbus have spoken. We do not want a ward system. We are fine with what we have going forward. If we need to increase, I think people are open to that. But outside of that, this is ridiculous. And it's money that could have gone, again, towards services that I fight for every day. I'm just so tired of hearing about listening to the citizens of Columbus, but yet we continue this conversation when the citizens of Columbus have spoken. Again, this is really frustrating for me. I don't know where else to go with this. Again, we have this public hearing, and I'm against changing the charter. So if you look at the percentage of people that are for the change and the people that are against the change in this room tonight, out of over 800,000 people, the percentage is the same, with me being the only one coming up here to speak about this. And to talk about fighting big money, again, I'm in labor and I fight big money every day. So if you guys want to know about what it's like to fight big money, come talk to me and how we are losing our rights as labor every day. You want to compare us to other cities with right to work, okay? So, like I say, I appreciate the time and enjoy your evening.
Any questions or comments for Mr. Moore? That's right, there's no questions or comments. You can go home and eat. No questions or comments for Mr. Moore. There are any other speaker slips? Last chance to go see Cheryl. Seeing none, any closing comments? President Pro Tem, Councilmember Harden? President Pro Tem?
Thank you. I just want to say thank you for hosting this hearing tonight in terms of letting this committee who have worked really, I think did a great job of researching information and providing, working with, for Chairwoman Cole leading the effort for the staff that have worked on this from the mayor's office to council. Thank you for your work on this and presenting this report to us tonight. And again, it was to just deliver the report and share the findings, the significant findings. And now there is work for this body to do. So I thank you. I thank everyone that came and shared their comments this evening.
Thank you again, President Klein, and thank you, President Pro Tem. I'm really going to just echo President Pro Tem's comments of appreciation. It's not obviously it is not a conversation that, you know, is easy, and it is extremely important. And the more conversations, the better about them. And so I appreciate everybody that spoke this evening. I appreciate everyone who came out to the public hearings. I appreciate everyone who participated in the election that we last year about this. This has been now a couple-year conversation. I believe that it's time for us to, as a council, as a city, make some decisions and move forward about and just put a stake in the ground about how we move forward. And I look forward to being a part of that process, and appreciate everyone leaning in. I don't think that this is perfect. I don't think that there is probably a perfect system. I think that's what they call government. I think that's what they call democracy. It's imperfect. But I think that every once in a while we do deserve an opportunity to look at ourselves and ask good questions. And it's never easy. So just appreciate you stepping out there on our behalf and asking those questions. I certainly appreciate the roles that area commissions play in really providing really good representation to council members and to our city and to their neighborhoods. And regardless of what we do and how we move forward, I think that we will have easy agreement as a council that that our area commissions stay strong and get even stronger for representation. But I look forward to this, giving folks, and again, I'm asking CTV to replay these hearings so that we can have a good feedback, as well as place the website where folks can read the full report. And thank you again, President Klein, for your leadership.
Thank you, Chair Harden. I'm soon to be Chair Harden of this committee. And to Chair Coe, Lourdes Barrasso de Padilla, Jeanette Bradley, Frida Gilliard, Reverend Tyrone Laws, Frederick Mills, Carrie McCarthy, John Rosenberger, Bob Vitale for their work, the staff work that was done by Edward Johnson, Brian Clark, Stephanie Magus, Tracy Retchen, Adam Freeman, and Andrea Blevins, for their time that they have taken to staff the committee to be adequately prepared to present a report to council. We appreciate your time and dedication to the City of Columbus. I believe moving forward, the gavel for this committee will be given to Chair Harden. There are certainly some outstanding questions that need to be rectified before this can be placed on the ballot. You know, two major things that come to mind in no particular order are the questions surrounding the appointment process, and also the one that gives me serious concern is the way that districts are drawn. I think any time that you draw districts, whether it would be at the city level, the state level, or the federal level, it certainly causes angst amongst the voters in the way that it's done in a fair and representative manner, so as not to gain some sort of political advantage, which we see way too often at the state level and the federal level particularly. So getting into those details, relying on staff and the public to figure out what the best practices are in crafting district lines, I think is vitally important to the integrity of a model like this should it be adopted by the citizens of the City of Columbus. So we look forward to those conversations and public input. Certainly thank you to the three speakers that came down today and took their time out of their schedule, all those that participated in the public process, and we stand adjourned.